But if you're like way in the back, maybe you want to come up and sit up front so you can see. No pressure. Do what you like. All right. We're your hosts this evening. I'm Tobias. This is Will. This is Matt. And Janita is over there making sure everything runs smoothly in our AV booth. And together, we have a number of curious and exciting topics to share with you.
As attendees of the Hand-Eye Supply Curiosity Club, you're all now members, provided you adhere to our philosophy.
Ex Curiositas Scientia.
We pledge to learn without prejudice in pursuit of our mutual goal, perpetual noviceship. We admit that it is impossible to know everything about anything, and thus we remain perpetually curious and perpetually novice.
This is our flag and mascot, Franklin. The lightning bolt represents the receipt of knowledge, the enlightenment of illumination, the resonance of truths understood. It awakens and excites us and makes us hungrier for more. Curiosity Club is made merrier by our fellow artisans at Fort George Brewery in Astoria, Oregon.
Let's give a warm Curiosity Club welcome to Jack Harris, Proprietor and Brewer at Fort George Brewery.
All right, welcome, thank you. I drove here from Astoria today where it is 55 degrees and cloudy, so
Hey Jack, can you turn on the mic more?
oh yeah, turn on the mic. One thing I had to do right. Is this going to go on the TV on its own?
Oh, the TV. The TV is a new thing for us. Yes. Before we have to project our stuff. Okay.
There we go.
All right.
Oops. It's not supposed to look like that. Uh-oh. It's not supposed to do that either.
Cover your eyes.
Hang on, I'm going to figure this out. Try this. Can you make it so it's just my screen on there?
Should be. Bear with me momentarily.
All right, while he's doing that, I'll get my shit together. All right, my talk tonight, wow, that's loud, is on the secret history of beer. And I want to give a warning. I have my disclaimer here. I can find it because disclaimers are important. I am going to be speaking positively and encouragingly about the drinking of beer. This is politically incorrect. While I realize that underage drinking is a problem and drinking and driving is a big societal problem, and alcoholism is linked to domestic abuse and poor health and general incompetence, as well as medical costs and whatnot. I am here to talk about what an amazing thing alcohol has been for humankind. Thank you. And there's a lot of other things that have gone on with beer that are a lot worse than that. And I believe all those issues can be mitigated through education and, if the self-driving cars is going to be a big one for everybody. Those kind of things. So anyhow, just so you know, I'm going to be talking about alcohol not as a societal ill, but as a natural thing. That's nice. That's much better. Thank you. So throughout the vast history of humankind, beer has been considered not as something you have on Friday nights or Saturday nights, but a part of everyday life. It's a source of nutrition, safe alternative to polluted drinking water. It's been regarded as a food, and most of all as a medicine, as sort of something you would intake all the time to preserve the body. It's been totally tied to religious rituals. It hasn't just been, it's been associated with ritual and religion, and it's used to celebrate, weddings, births, deaths, holidays, and there are certain lucky priests and priestesses whose job it was to drink beer every morning just to make sure the sun came up for everybody. So That's kind of where I'm coming from here. Beer has been abused, as I mentioned before, but really the abuses that I'm concerned about are the abuses of those in the power controlling beer, diluting beer, controlling the profit from it, adulterating, watering it down, taxing it, fighting over it, and banning it have been bigger issues than the abuse. Those are the abuses that I worry about. So in my opinion, it's only really been probably the last 60, 70 years, the last half of the 20th century that beer has been kind of associated with frat parties, deadbeat dads. Well, let's see, first of all, beer is old. Beer goes way back. And I'm going to show a little timeline here, but it's much older than this stuff. It's only been in the last little bit of time that it's been associated with abuses, such as fraternities and deadbeat dads, and I think it all kind of came to a peak with Spuds McKenzie trying to convince us that we were going to get laid if we drank really bad beer. So, and I'm not dissing on, I'm wearing the Hams hat today, so I'm not dissing on light American lagers or anything, but there was a down period for beer. I'm going to kind of talk about how we got to that point and what happened before that. This talk is going to meander a little bit, and basically it's going to do this broad, long history of beer and how it's come to be what it is today, and go through the brewing process and the ingredients that go into it and how they've evolved a bit. All right, but fortunately, there has always been a dedicated group of people determined to revive the honorable tradition of beer, the variety and the integrity of beer, and beer culture. So, here we go. Beer history is as old as humanity. I'm not talking about creationism in humanity here. I'm talking about real evolutionary history. And even biblically, though, Noah provisioned the ark with beer. That is recorded. And we're not sure if he had 2 of every beer style on board, but it's in the ancient text that there was beer aboard the ark. I'm talking more about this macro view of where beer started, and then as this talk it's going to kind of narrow down to more of the European, Northern European style of brewing that we sort of consider beer today. So one point I'd like to wrap your heads around is how long beer has been with us. So the first beers were, so if you look at like the evolutionary history of people in all of time, we are like this tiny little spot at the very end of the scale. Modern brewing is very similar to that in the entire span of human history of brewing. It's just been around for a long time. Most of the scientific, technological, industrial knowledge of beer has come about in the last little bit of beer making. I don't want to give you the impression that earlier brewers didn't care about the quality, weren't really interested in the ingredients and the quality of the ingredients and the processes they were putting into it. They used to make really good beer. People have always made really good beer. It's just a little different than how we do it now. Now we kind of do it much more scientifically. So what is beer? At this point, we're starting all the way back. Beer is any fermented beverage. And basically to ferment something, you need sugars. So you can get those sugars from grains, from fruits, from honey. What else is on my list there? Tree sap. Wine, beer, and mead were at the very beginning, we're all the same thing. And they sort of started to split off. I will get to where they split off at a certain point. Every indigenous culture in the world, on Earth, has a beer-making tradition. According to my source here, the one exception to that is the Aborigines of Australia, and there's probably a whole lecture involved in why that is. But sadly, most of those are lost to us. And who first thought of making beer? So this is my tricky slide here. See if I can make this work. But so these are the marula fruit film. You guys may have seen this at some point. The marula fruit grows in Africa, and they look like little plums, and they grow on the trees, and then they get overripe, and they start to fall off the trees, and it becomes kind of an animal party. All these animals come. The elephants the wildebeests, the monkeys. Everybody shows up to party with the marilla fruit. And I like the one scene here. There's a, they had this really cheesy music that went to this too, but like this guy, she's like, one more for the road, you know?
So it kind of looks like a frat house.
Kind of, but obviously people long ago were able to witness this, and they probably wanted to see what was so fun about all these, the marilla fruit. I just love this video, it's great stuff. I wanted, while this is playing out here, another common thread in all this brewing stuff is that up until very recently, most brewing was done exclusively by women. So that'll come up again here when we get into the politics and religion part of this talk. So that was taken at some point. All right, we're done with the video here. The first recorded or known sources of proven human methodical brewing, they found these jar shards in China at 7,000 BC, so about 9,000 years ago. And they've tested positive for, sorry, my slide doesn't go all the way to the bottom of the screen here, but they've tested positive for a mixture of some sort of fermented beverage inside of those. The first real wine, they found wine crafts in Iran from 5400 BC. So that's kind of like way back that we've realized that people were actually brewing. The Babylonians had 20 different kinds of beer documented in 4,000-year-old tablets. These also depict that brewers were respected members of society. So, things haven't changed too much, so that's great. Of course, this is also when, as soon as people were brewing on a regular basis, they started to abuse the privilege. And Hammurabi's laws, which are some of the basis of the original law, a lot of them were made especially dedicated to brewing. And so they were really frowned upon any sort of watering down of the beer. And another thing that was completely forbidden was selling beer. You could only trade beer. You could never sell it. So that was something they frowned upon there. What do I have here? So yeah, Babylonian tablets, detailed recipes for beer, 4300 BC. The Picts of Scotland, they've documented, they were making heather mead in Scotland in 2000 BC. And then there are Egyptian texts that are recorded from 1600 BC that included over 100 different medical prescriptions that included beer in the prescriptions. In fact, Egyptian laborers were afforded 4 loaves of bread and 2 jugs of beer every day. Here is an Egyptian hieroglyph for a brewer, which makes sense to me. This is kind of a pictogram of an Egyptian brewery. And what I like about this is I put this next to a 1907 textbook photo or a pictogram. It was a 1907 textbook for brewery design, and you can see the similarities in the flow of everything here, from the raw ingredients and the process and the storage from top to bottom. I thought that was kind of interesting little juxtaposition there. All right, okay, so about this time is when we're going to split off and start describing beer as being a grain-based fermentable. So mead is honey-based, wine is fruit or grape-based, and it's the Egyptians that probably started using barley first. They found the Egyptians cultivating barley, and barley makes terrible bread. The only reason you would cultivate barley is for the use of beer. Excuse me. And the reason barley makes such great beer is barley has nutrients that the yeast can reproduce with really well. Other grains are missing different elements of those nutrients. Barley is by far the best grain to brew with. You can make alcohols out of like rice, but if you ever read a recipe for making sake, it's really, really difficult. You have to get up like 3 times in the middle of the night for weeks on end to make it work. And basically the whole thing when you're making beers, you need some sort of sugar to ferment. And so they are extracting the sugar out of the grain. And as far as the yeast, I haven't mentioned yeast yet because that is very, very late in mankind's knowledge of how it makes beer. So some of the different, what do we have here? I think I have a list here. There's sorghum. There's, I thought I had a list of all these different, oh, here we go. I skipped ahead a little bit. So in Africa, they would use millet, red millet, and maize and cassava for brewing with. North America, persimmon and agave were used. South America, corn and sweet potatoes were used to make beer with. Japan, we talked about rice. China used oats and sorghum were the different things that their brewing traditions were based on. All right, so the malting process, the reason we get the barley, you have to convert the barley to make sugar for you. So it's just like in grade school when you take they have you take the bean pod and put it between two wet paper towels to get it to sprout. The maltster has the same process. They get the grain wet and warm. They basically trick it into thinking it's spring. And so to grow, it's got to convert all its enzymes inside of the barley seed into starches and carbohydrates that the plant then, or the baby plant, can burn to grow its first leaves and roots, start doing photosynthesis and support itself. So the malting process, they get it warm and wet. As soon as that first little rootlet comes out, they stop the process. And that is malted barley, and they dry it out. And that is malted barley. And that's pretty easy. You could imagine a bag of grain getting wet and somebody then putting it out in the sun and then using that to turn into, get it deriving sugar water from later. None of that is recorded. And then the extraction process, I have a couple of different examples of the different ways. Mash tuns is what they're called. So basically, you're filling this mash tun. This is like a homebrew setup. This is a glorified homebrew setup. I used to work for them, though, I can say that. And here's a real mash tun, or a more modern one. And basically, it's a big, if you imagine it as a drip coffee filter, and you're just spraying hot water over the top of that. It's running through the grain bed and dissolving the sugars and rinsing the sugars off the grain, and then running through some sort of screen that holds that grain back, and then you're getting, it's like your coffee maker. You get the sugar water out of it. The two bins there at the end there, that's spent grain. We send ours off to a farmer to feed to his dairy cows. And the sugar water, it's basically sugar water we're getting at it. We call it wort in the brewery. So we'll go back to the timeline here. 5500 BC, or 55 BC, the Romans started introducing grain-based beers to Northern Europe. That's when the Northern Europeans start using grain-based, making grain-based beers. It wasn't until 1000 AD that hops were introduced and used regularly. And about 500 AD is when the hydrometer was invented. And the hydrometer is a nice little tool. It just helps with consistency. So basically, it's measuring the density of the liquid. You got this guy floating right here. And when you've got a bunch of sugar dissolved in here, it's going to float higher, and you just put little marks on it, and you mark where it's floating. Then as this liquid ferments, it gets less dense. The sugar ferments out of it, and it loses density. And so this will sink down into it over the fermentation period. And it's the difference between those two readings you get, and you can calculate how much alcohol is in it. So that was invented. That's a nice little tool, just for consistency's sake. That was invented about 500, 500 AD. Keep moving through this here. Another piece of important brewing equipment is the kettle. And so you need to boil the beer. That sterilizes it, so you're kind of starting with zero stuff in it. And then it caramelizes it a bit. I've got a couple reasons why we boil. It caramelizes it, which adds color and flavor to the wort. It condenses it so that whatever the sugar concentration is in there, you're going to increase that concentration by just boiling off liquid. And then whatever essential oils from the herbs you're putting into the beer will get boiled into it at that point. And so this is where we can talk about herbs and what goes into the beer. The reason why, if you were just to ferment out the sugar water, the human palate would not appreciate that very much. The human palate wants balance. You need some sort of bitterness to balance out that sweetness. It would just be cloyingly sweet otherwise. And so people have used all sorts of things in that. See what my next slide is. So traditional brewing herbs, chamomile. And again, these all came from medicinal sort of backgrounds. So you get a great fragrant odor out of the chamomile. It's a mild sedative. It lowers fevers. It's good for the gastric system. Cow parsnip, that's that next one. It's a bittering. It's antiseptic. Dandelion has calming effects and is very nutritious. Heather. Actually, there's this moss, this thing that grows on the heather that is mildly psychotropic. That's the heather beers that the Picts made were famous for that effect. Juniper is used for the aromatics and the antibiotic properties there. Mandrake, that's this guy over here. And that's an aphrodisiac and is used for fertility, and it's also consciousness expanding. At least that's what they claim. We've got some more herbs that people used. Nettles, super nutritious and great for bittering. Rosemary is a preservative and aromatics. We make a spruce beer. I was hoping to bring some of our spruce beer tonight, but the spruce buds came out so late this year it was not ready, so it won't be ready until next week. St. John's wort, wormwood, yarrow, all those things were always used in all sorts of beers. In fact, gruit is this really famous concoction that they were making at the very early Middle Ages, and it's basically a grain-based liquid, and then they used bog myrtle, and this is from like 500 to 1500 AD in Europe. They're using bog myrtle, yarrow, and rosemary, and everybody had their specially guarded recipe on how to make the best gruit. But the end result was usually a highly intoxicating, aphrodisiacal, and psychotropic concoction that would stimulate the mind, create euphoria, and enhance the sexual drive. And so it would literally lead to orgies. That was the best I could do for an orgy picture. And this is where some of this controversy comes in with religion. I mean, there was a point where women were kicked out of the medical field as midwives. They were kicked out of religious fields when it kind of went from polytheology to monotheism. And they were kicked out of the brewing world too because people did not like some of the stuff that was going on, especially the Protestants. The Protestant intolerance of inebriation goes way past gruit and is the root of temperance movements that have banned all sorts of inebriation, I guess I'll just go with that word. Hops were bitterly resisted. So when they first started making beer with hops, that was in 1400, I believe. I have on here somewhere. Let's see if I got another slide. So here's some hops. So this is finally where hops come into the beer. Is in 1400, they started using hops in beer. I mean, hops were well known as a medicinal herb for a long time. Certainly, different kind of beers were made with hops. But it was never the primary bittering agent in beer. So about 1400, they started using them in northern European countries. But this is a great book. This is called Sacred and Herbal Healing Beers by Stephen Buhner. This came out about 20 years ago, and which is amazing. I saw him speak when he was on this book tour at a naturopathic conference. But anyhow, I just want to read this one passage he's got in here. It's great. Hops, when they began to be suggested for use as a primary additive in both Germany and England, were bitterly resisted. I don't think that pun was intended. Those who held a monopoly on gruit production in Europe, in Germany, and on pure ale in England fought hop introduction through the legislatures, proclamations of the royalty, writings of the day's medicinal practitioners, and through church edict. The struggle over what ingredients could be allowed in ale lasted in its most furious forms for about 200 years. This fight occurred, interestingly, simultaneously with the Protestant Reformation. The accusations of the powerful interest of opposing hops can still be found in governmental records in both England and Germany. Brewers in England complained to the mayor of London about hops, and he goes on to kind of quote some of these people basically bitching about the use of hops in beer. The reason the Protestants were really interested in using hops in beer, because they had basically the opposite effect of the herbs being used in gruit. They're very sedative. They put you to sleep. Brewer's droop is kind of a fact. But hops finally won out, as with the Protestant Revolution. And about, see if I got this slide right. Let's see here. This is, so hops went out around the beginning of the 16th century. So in 1492, got this Columbus. He notes beer making in the New World. They were using corn and black birch sap to make beer with. And 1516 is when the Reinheitsgebot, it's a German purity law. And this set a standard. Again, there's always this concern about people adulterating beer, putting bad stuff into beer, watering beer down, and not selling a pure thing. But there's a lot of people, and including this guy, who thinks that the real motivation behind the Reinheitsgebot was to get rid of gruit and to make hops the exclusive.
Were they lagering at this point?
Not yet. They started lagering in the early 1800s, which I do not note in this talk. And this other great little thing here. The first Europeans colonizing Virginia, they tried to make their own beer, and they immediately sent word back to England to send them beer. But here is the Reinheitsgebot for anyone who reads German. But I'll just translate this. That in all cities, markets, and in the country, the only ingredients used for brewing of beer must be barley, hops, and water. So you note they're kind of missing out on an ingredient there in beer. They still have not really figured out yeast. I'm not saying they were ignorant of yeast. Yes?
You can finish your sentence.
Yeah, I'm not saying that they were ignorant of yeast, did not know how to use yeast, or didn't understand yeast. They didn't understand yeast scientifically as we understand it now.
Just going back to your herbal slide, I've read that some Irish societies would use St. John's wort to make a naturally antidepressant beer.
Yes.
Have you ever explored maybe getting into medicinal type beers, but obviously you can label it as such, but with 14?
I will get into some of the future of beer at the end.
Okay, just one.
I need to repeat questions.
Oh.
Is that what you were going to tell me?
No.
Oh, okay.
I just kind of want to for my own benefit, clarify. So basically, most alcohol falls under the beer umbrella.
Yes.
So
well, in my mind,
wine can be beer.
Wine is fruit beer.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to
Well, it was especially very early on.
Yeah.
Nowadays, I mean, and as late as what we're talking about right here, they had diversified and they were distinctive things at this point.
Right.
So in Greece.
Originally, the way that you're defining beer, or the way that it is defined, is pretty much all of it.
Any fermented item.
Okay, awesome. And so also in under that assumption, then hops doesn't really it's not integral to any of that. It just happens to be its own hops beer.
It's sort of a result of politics, religion, cultural norms. That's what made it make it define beer. These days, you can't call something beer unless you put hops in it, even by the standards of our governments. So our spruce beer, we literally drop 2 little hop pellets in it, so we can say we put some hops in it. But unhopped beer is technically against the law. It's not. No one's ever going to track that down.
Not to get you too off track, but what's the difference between a barley wine then and a beer?
A barley wine is a style of beer that basically it got the term barley wine for being so strong. And a double IPA is basically replaced the barley wine.
I was just going to say, you mentioned barley in particular makes great beer. Why has barley fallen out as the go-to grain?
Because of the nutritional value to the yeast. The yeast will reproduce and be healthy and happy. If you use other grains, you always have to add some other yeast nutrient to that grain to keep the yeast healthy. Okay, so we have just made it so only hops can be used in beer, and they were resisted. And like I say, they don't have a real working knowledge of what the yeast is or how it works yet. Though, again, they've been making great beer this whole time, so obviously they know how to handle it. So the Middle Ages represented the rise of the commercial brewery. Before that, beer was always made in the house, in the inn, always made by women. The priests, so the first people to commercialize beer were these abbeys, these religious centers that would start making beer, and they were a place people would travel to and back and forth, so they would have their beer making thing. They were usually allowed to make beer by edict of a king or whoever was ruling that area. And you could do a whole talk on the politics of how all these the politics, and they went from the monasteries and the little fiefdoms and whatnot, and then the people that really took control of beer and beer production were the city-states that started to develop in Europe and started to really control the power. And so there is, I think I have all these different breweries right here that are still producing beer. They were usually city-state. There's a few here that are still related to monasteries or abbeys, but a lot of them were state-issued licenses to brew. And once you had a license to brew, you basically like had the Budweiser distributorship for your area. You were gold. You were the only one that could make beer, and everybody wants beer. So it's just part of the culture. So this, pardon me, this is where beer has always been controlled. Someone has always controlled the production and the distribution of beer, but it's just getting a lot more formalized now in the Middle Ages. Let's see if there's anything else important here. Let's go blow past there. So, yeah, I've got this whole thing about how the feudal lords and the clerics, they're fighting over all this stuff, but it turned out to be the enterprising burghers and the city-states that took over the relegating the beer and then letting a few clergy people make beer under their name. And so business and commerce start becoming really important in beer. But it's still, beer is really heavy, and beer is hard to move around, and beer spoils, and it's a difficult thing to centralize. So it's still very fragmented. Everyone's still making their own stuff. All right, and so then we're getting to the early Industrial Revolution. And the late 1700s, so like I say, it's hard to move beer around. It's very, very heavy. So the late 1700s, you get the steam engine, or maybe the mid 1700s. And so you can start moving beer, and while they had invented a pump in Egypt in 2000 BC, it wasn't until the late 1700s they really perfected a centrifugal pump. Well, I guess we had 1851 for the centrifugal pump, but they were starting to make pumps and all that kind of industrial things. And this is where we're getting more and more particular here, but in Britain, porters were the very first industrial beers that were made en masse for the masses, and centralizing beer making locations. And this is also, and they started working on refrigeration at that time, but they started going too fast, and they got too big, too fast. There was so much money to be made in this. They start taking shortcuts. And again, once again, people are cheating and starting to, they didn't have, the Reinheitsgebot only applied to Germany. It didn't apply to England. And so people were really messing each other up with some of this stuff. So I found this guy named Frederick Accum in 1820. He was an operative chemist, and he wrote this treatise on adulterations of food and culinary poisons, exhibiting the fraudulent sophistications of beer. And so basically, he really brought to the attention, I'm trying to think of the book at the turn of the last century that talked about all of the abuses going on in the slaughterhouses, but he kind of did the same thing for beer in the early 1800s. So this is a quote out of his thing here. The Jungle, exactly. That was a much easier name than the treatise on adulterations of food and culinary poisons. The intoxicating quantities of porter are to be ascribed to the various drugs intermixed with it. It is evident some porter is more heady than other, and it arises from the greater or less quantity of stupefying ingredients malt to produce intoxication must be used in such large quantities as would very much diminish, if not totally exclude, the brewer's profits. Basically, he's saying to get that wasted on a beer, the brewer would have to be using so much grain, there's no way he could be making any money by selling it for what he did. So they were adulterating it. They were putting stuff, it's called fishberry or levant nut. The scientific name is Coculus indicus, and it was normally used as a pesticide, but it kind of got you drunker. They used beer darkeners. They put other intoxicants and flavor enhancers in beer. There just weren't any rules at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and they started messing with it. And so he called BS on that, and then they started cracking down on that. So it wasn't until somebody discovered that was going on that they cracked down on it. And then I think we get to, we have a beer interlude. I have a whole different set of cards for the beer interlude. So this is my little beer interlude here. This kind of like just focuses in on how cultural and political and geographic stuff can come to define a beer and create a beer. So just to start that off, Captain James Cook, on his third voyage, he went to the Sandwich Islands, which Hawaii as we know them, and he featured this spruce beer on his ships. The Admiralty, the British Admiralty, spent tons of money and energy trying to figure out how to have beer on their boats. Their sailors depended on having beer for the nutritional value. Spruce beer particularly had vitamin C in it and prevented scurvy. But they were having a really hard time figuring out how to keep their Navy men in their beer. They kind of used rum, but rum was a poor substitute because it was so intense and didn't have the nutritional value of the beer. And so they do all these things like try to concentrate the beer and then rehydrate it and let it ferment on the ships. But in the tropics, that's really sketchy. It just didn't work very well. And so the British Navy had this whole thing going on where they were trying to figure out how to keep beer on the ships. But moving along from that, so that they had this history of trying to figure it out. Well, the British, like I say, had this long history of wanting to have beer. And so they started their colonies in India over here. Where's India? Right here, right? So they have to ship all their stuff all the way around the Horn of Africa and up through the Indian Ocean to get the beer there. So that's basically what's happening is beer does not do well going through stuff like that. So it's a 3 to 5 month journey to get around here. They would leave, generally the ships would be leaving in November, between November and February in the winter, to arrive here in India between March and May. So they would avoid the monsoon season. They had to cross the Earth, cross the equator twice, and basically the beer, when they leave, was about 52 degrees. By the time they get to the equator, the beer, and it's in the holds of the ships in these big barrels, it'd be 81 degrees at the equator and cool off to about 60 degrees as they were rounding the Horn of Africa. And then by the time they got it to Bombay, it was 81 degrees again. And anyone who's had to store or transport beer, the idea of changing those temperatures, raising them up and down, and constantly moving the beer around is like the worst thing you can do to beer. So the beer was showing up in India musty, sour, flat, and they tried all these different things. They tried shipping it flat and then recarbonating when it got there. And the problem with brewing in India is it was too hot there, and they didn't have the refrigeration to keep it cold. And so they couldn't figure out how to do it, and it was a big problem. And so the beer lacked a shelf life, and a lot of the beers that they were making at the time that were really popular in London were these dark porters that was really popular in the early 1800s, and they're industrial beers there. And nobody in Bombay wanted to drink a porter when it was 90 degrees and 100% humidity out. So they'd have these official tasters in Bombay. The ships would come in, they'd taste the beer, and they'd say, no, we're not buying that. And so that's a waste of money. People are losing money on that. And then there was lots of money they knew there was money to be made on this, because basically they're bringing back all this stuff from India, filling the ships up, they didn't have anything to take to India. The ships were basically going half empty. So there was all this empty space on their ships. And anyone in transportation knows you want to have your stuff full going both ways. So they knew there was a bunch of money to be made. So I don't know how much detail to get into here. I don't know how long I'm going, but all right. So there's this thing called Hudson India Ale, and it's this pale ale. It's kind of actually reddish brown. Basically, the idea was overhopped and in higher alcohol. And the way it came around was, well, they were shipping this beer there, and it was doing all right. And this guy had dominated the market very unethically for the most part. If another brewer tried selling beer to India, he would flood the market with a bunch of beer, drop his prices down till the other guy went out of business, and then he could charge whatever he wanted. Because he could charge whatever he wanted there. They couldn't brew there. He knew they had a solid market. And so at one point, though, this backfires on him. So they started squeezing these guys, the brokers in India, trying to get more profits, but they were making fewer and fewer friends. About this time, Bass Ale, which is located in Burton-on-Trent, which was kind of in northern England, they lost their Baltic. They were selling all this beer to the Baltic states and Russia, and because of the Napoleonic Wars, he lost that market. So he had all this brewery capacity and no one to sell the beer to. And so they basically had this dinner meeting with this guy one night from the East India Company, and didn't really know about the India market, but they knew, this guy came and talked to him and said, look, you can't, they can't make beer there. We need to figure out how to get beer there. So they started making this beer of, well, they tasted one of these Hudson's pale ales, these India pale ales, and they thought it was disgusting because it was so bitter. But he said, hey, we can make those here. So he started making it. Well, the thing is, I don't have a picture of Burton-on-Trent here, but northern, it's just in a different geologic spot. So they have all this limestone and really hard water. And whereas the beers they were making in London, they have really soft water in London. And the end result was he make a really nice, crisp, hoppy beer that was palatable, that people would really enjoy. And so he started selling that. And even though his maltster tried it and spit it out, he didn't like it at all. But the first year, they sold 34 hogsheads. The second year, they sold 300 hogsheads, and then they were off and running. And for the next 25 years, they dominated the market and created this whole beer style called IPAs. And because it was this confluence of culture, history, politics, and geography, and geology, because of the hardness of that water, they took over the market, and that beer from London didn't sell anymore. And they actually they only exported that beer at first because they didn't think anybody wanted it. But in 1827, one of their ships, as it was leaving full of beer, wrecked and washed up on shore, and all these locals started drinking it, said, hey, we wanted that. And so that's how it all got out.
So is the high alcohol percentage that allowed it to make it the whole time, or was it
the high alcohol percentage and the excessive use of hops as a preservative?
Water hardness or softness still play a big role in how a beer tastes?
Yes, absolutely. Because you will get a different effect. It affects the pH levels and the nutrients available for the yeast. I mean, we could talk an hour on that alone, but yes, it absolutely has an effect on it.
Can you not grow barley in a tropical climate? Why couldn't they brew in India?
The issue with brewing in India back at this time in the late 1700s, early 1800s was refrigeration. So they could not control their ferments. They had these runaway ferments at 100 degrees that wouldn't make very good beer. Okay, so I have a couple pictures here just so these are the different size. You know, whenever someone asks me, they come out, give a brewery tour, and they say, so how many beers a year do you make? And I was like, I have no idea. Well, how many gallons of beer do you make? And I was like, I have no idea. We're still stuck with these, we measure everything in barrels, which is 32 gallons. And I have no idea if there's an actual barrel on there. But they have firkins, barrels, hogsheads, pipes, and tons. A ton is 256 gallons. That's kind of where all that comes from, is those original things. So, kind of done my notes now, but It wasn't until 1857 that Louis Pasteur discovered yeast. That's how recent in human history that we identified what a yeast cell was and how it worked. And he proved that it's a living organism. Those are kind of some pictures of yeast. And here, and this is what I really enjoy about it, is so mankind does not know. If you go on a brewery tour, there's a certain point the brewer will look at you and almost lie right to you and say, we make beer. Because the brewer doesn't make beer so much as we make really good yeast food. Yeast is the only thing that can eat those sugar molecules and break them down into carbon dioxide. Heat is another byproduct, and alcohol. Mankind does not know how to synthetically produce alcohol. So if you look at it in the big picture, people and yeast have co-evolved for the higher purpose of making beer. And this is the organic chemistry. I have another slide here. Organic chemistry means it's time for a beer. But the organic chemistry behind the production of alcohol. And there are, if you know organic chemistry, which I do not know that clearly, but I've had this pointed out to me, there are some gaps in here where they're not exactly clear on how yeast actually do this. You cannot synthesize alcohol without yeast. So it's still, even though we like to think that we're super sophisticated and super scientific and super knowledgeable about, I mean, we've taken apart yeast and know their DNA, but we don't know exactly how this process works in the end. But to a brewer, what it looks like, what you see here is a blow-off, a blow-off bucket. The yeast is coming out of the top of the fermenter and going out onto the floor, and that's about 2 hours of work to clean that up. That's all I know about it. And these are some examples of different fermentation vessels. So, you know, people have been fermenting stuff, like I say, 10,000 years. So they understood yeast, not to the level or the way we understand it now, but they always understood it. There's South American tribes that the way they brewed was they'd sit around and chew on a starchy root, and everyone would sit in a circle and spit into a big urn, and then you had this stick, and the stick would have these yeast cells dried on it, and you would stir that with that house stick, and that would create that beer. Those yeast cells would go into that liquid, that sugar, and ferment, and apparently it made perfectly good beer. And then they'd put it up, and it would dry, and then they'd use it in the next batch. They didn't really understand what was going on. They called it, they had all sorts of different terms for what was going on there. And so basically the four ingredients of beer: the water, the grain, the sugar, the hops, and the yeast. And there is just a randomly selected brewery to kind of show where all this goes. Here's our grain tank back here, our hot water. The mash tun is where we extract the grain, and then the kettle is right back here where we boil it all up, and then the fermenters all line up. This is the brew house that makes the beer, and the fermenters line up here. And it's been done for centuries that way, in one way or another, maybe not with stainless steel. By the end of the 1800s, just about every beer style we know today was created and realized. There really aren't any new beer styles. It's very hard to think of one. I can't off the top of my head. You know, an Imperial IPA. So the IPAs we're drinking now that you guys have there, if you were to like get in a time machine and go back to Bombay and show up with one of those, I'm really skeptical they would recognize that as something they were drinking at the time.
Would it be more or less bitter?
What I tell people on my brewery tours is that people these days in human history are drinking more and more different kinds of varieties of hops than ever before. Hops have just kind of gone nuts, and they are, when I give my brewery tour, I tell people if you're starting in your own brew pub, whatever you make, just call it an IPA and it'll sell a lot better. People are just very hop focused right now, and I'll get to my opinion on that in a second. I love hops, don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan. So late 1800s, refrigeration comes around, and that's where we really kind of finished the last bit of technology for brewing. Has really been the refrigeration and the ability to store beer and transport beer cold. Then we went through our little experiment with prohibition, and this is really the cause of what I call the dark ages of beer, because post-Prohibition, what happened is it wiped out all of this little brewers, and like a lot of food and other things in especially the United States, centralized production and uniformity became the norm, and you get a lowest common denominator, and the microbrew craze. I'm just going to skip over that because basically you guys all know about hams. The microbrew craze, I see it as just another part of what's happened to the kind of fragmentation of that, where people started wanting to know where their food was made and who made it, and beer just fell into that, and that's what happened with, once you could start making beer in little batches, and the big brewers legally made it illegal to have a little brewery. There was just no way that they just kind of legalized everybody out of it unless you had a gajillion dollars to start up a big process. You couldn't get started. So it wasn't until like the McMenamins made it, helped pass the laws in Oregon that made it legal to sell and make your own beer. And the big brewers made it impossible to do that for a long time. And so like anything, like, you go to compare your local grocery store, like Whole Foods, to a grocery store from the 70s now, and there's just, everybody is a lot more interested in what they're eating and where it comes from and diversity than they are in just getting that thing in a can that, at one point in the 50s, everyone thought at some point all you have to do is pop a pill and you would have all of the nutrients you needed for the day. People are a lot more, I think, sophisticated now about what they're putting into their bodies and eating and drinking.
The taste was different though too.
What's that?
The taste was different too, right?
The taste of like industrial beer
versus a small beer.
Right, and so that's what I'm kind of saying is that people started to realize they had a palate, and that this lowest common denominator of flavor and character in a beer wasn't acceptable anymore, and so you kind of open up this whole cornucopia of different styles. And
would it be possible to reproduce like a historical beer to compare it to something modern? Has someone done that?
So that's hard to do because we don't have a time machine. We don't have a way to go back to the Middle Ages and try one of those beers. They have, this every once in a while they'll find a shipwreck with a bunch of bottles of beer in it that's 200 years old, and they'll pull those yeast cells out and reproduce them and make beer out of that. And that's interesting and that's great. But I think it's kind of, so this is going into the future here, is what I would like to see is a continuation of this fragmentation and specialization in different beers. And while you've got breweries now opening that specialize in sour beers, and there's still some rules that make it very hard to make all herbal beers. It's like I was saying, you can't even call it a beer if it doesn't have hops in it, and they're really strict about what you're putting in it. But there's a lot of brewers that are experimenting with pepper beers and different herbs in beers, and I would just love to see more of that, and people getting interested in more of that. Just people are very cautious right now, and it's almost like a hop monopoly right now for the herbs and things going into beer. And I think there's a lot more to be done there. And then the whole medicinal side, I would love to see your naturopath be able to prescribe, St. John's wort beer for you if you're suffering depression. Hops beer is great if you can't sleep very well. But there are other ailments and stuff that I think that beer is an excellent delivery device for those herbs. It's just that people have been kind of trained to think of beer as a party item and not as a daily useful food or medicine. And that's kind of the thinking that's got to change to go back to the future, something like that. So I think that's kind of where this talk ends, unless you've got questions.
So you talk about the rise of the craft beer and awareness of craft beer. The percentage of the market is what, in Oregon it's the highest in the nation, one of the highest in the nation, but still in Oregon it's like 25-30%. So there's still a lot of people.
There is still a lot of work to be done, and we're still fighting the big industrial brewers. I'll say them by name in case they're watching this. Anheuser-Busch is going out of their way not only to buy up popular little breweries and sort of put their name on that stuff. They're building little beer Disneylands that'll be like little spots for brewers to go to. There's this big controversy with Golden Road that was bought by AB a few years ago, and they want to build this place in North Oakland that is basically this huge beer garden. And the lady from Golden Road just the other day had all these people saying, we don't want this here, we don't want Anheuser-Busch doing this. We don't have anything to do with Anheuser-Busch. And you're like, what are you talking about? You were owned by Anheuser-Busch. But she just refuses to acknowledge that. She's just part of the problem. And they're just trying to water it down. They're trying to muddy the water and to obfuscate the difference between a big industrial owner and locally produced, locally made stuff. And I think a lot of people would prefer to buy something. Some people don't care, and that's fine. They don't care. I buy hams. I don't mind hams. But that's not what I live on, and that's not... Did I answer that question? I'm just babbling now.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think just to contextualize, like, okay, now we know, we've got high awareness of craft. Well, we in this room or in this state even have high awareness of craft, but just keeping it in perspective, that 75% of the state doesn't.
Yep, so that, for me, that means we're about 20% in Oregon of market share for craft beer. And that's kind of a national goal that they're working closer and closer to all the time. All that means I got 80% of the beer drinkers out there still to talk to. And so that's plenty of opportunity for me. I just see it as opportunity. And it always has been. I haven't seen it swinging back yet, where people are going back to Budweiser or back to bland industrial beer just because it's cheap. I haven't seen that. Yes?
What's your favorite beer?
So that's a good question. My favorite beer, it's kind of cliche, but it's the one in my hand at any given time. So. Yes.
All right. Well, this sort of dovetails into that. Do you brew just you? Like obviously you have a lot to work with and play with, but like, do you experiment? Do you home brew, or maybe you like brew at Fort George, but it's just your own project, your own personal project? And if so, what's that?
So the last beer I made at Fort George, I do not brew there very often anymore for a couple reasons. For one thing, I have a lot of other things to do, and but I've got this whole crew of brewers, and I think it's a great thing to let them. It's really inspirational for them to be able to come up with stuff. But my last beer I made was a ginkgo blueberry stout, and I picked those things. I was talking to my wife, is a naturopath, and I wanted to make a brain beer that would while you were drinking it, it would help you think about your beer better. Was kind of the idea behind it. So I like playing with that stuff. I don't know if it had that effect.
Brew?
My wife, no, she's not a brewer, but she helps me out with that stuff sometimes. And I love making the spruce beer. Because it is so simple and it's so unique, it's delicious, and it's really local. We go out and brewers, we go out to this little this farm that has a bunch of spruce trees, and we spend all afternoon out there. It takes about 10 cases of beer to do this, and we pick 400 pounds of spruce buds out there, fill these big bags, and brew with it. And it's really fun. I really appreciate doing that.
Do you sell it?
Oh yeah, it'll be on sale next week.
Are you working on legislation that would change the rules, maybe just in Oregon, about having to add?
Nope, these are TTB rules. These are all set at a national level, and I think for the next 3 years, 8 months, 12 days or so, we're going to be focusing on just keeping things as they are, and hoping for that. I keep passing up one over here.
If beer's treated well, how long do you think it retains its best flavor?
So there are styles of beer. There's a Sati beer that's made in Finland, that's made with juniper, that is made to be drank within 2 days. That style of beer. We also do barrel-aged stouts, where we will brew the stout, ferment it, put it in a oak barrel, ignore it for a year, and then blend it back and put it into bottles. And I had one of our first rounds of that we bottled. And we do all these things to make sure they're going to stay good. Like we wax dip them so the bottle cap doesn't leak or anything. And that, I think, peaked at 2 years after it had gone into the bottle. It's probably not getting any better now, but it would probably be great for another 3 or 4 years.
All right,
We have on our IPAs, a 45-day, well, our super fresh IPAs, like our three-way IPA we're putting out soon, it's a 45-day pull date. I think our Vortex has a 90-day pull date, and then our stouts have a 180-day pull date. There's one guy back here.
Yeah, I was interested to hear you say like that, wine and beer were do the same thing, like split off. Is there a point in time is wine, right now the cultural sort of attitude towards it is like classier than beer, right? I would argue maybe you don't feel the same way, but like is there a moment in time where that sort of split, or is there anything to point to where it's like beer is sort of like on a lower like cultural or like
not as perceived as sophisticated as wine. I'm not sure where those like cultural attitudes prevailed and created that. If you do the science on it, there's more flavor. I'm trying to think of the right word. Things that make flavor. Beer is more complex than wine. If you tear it apart, like with I can't think of what the exact flavor components are, but there are more in beer than there are wine. And so that's getting more and more recognized now as the potential complexity of beer being much higher. That's not the case for hams. Ham's always going to taste like hams. But, you've got some, what do they call that stuff, the pink stuff that they drink with ice cubes. They're not, what's that? I'm thinking of something even. What's that?
Wine cooler.
Wine coolers. Anyhow, wine has its low-end stuff too. So I think we can all get along. I'll tell you my beer taster joke is. You got your wine tasters and your beer tasters, and people tasting beer always swallow. So that's my beer tasting joke. Yes.
What is your background?
My background?
Do you have a degree in chemistry?
I do not. I do have a degree in natural science with an emphasis in geology. And I got into brewing right out of school. I went to the University of Puget Sound, and I got a job with McMenamins out of school, and that's I've been brewing ever since. So.
Are you an Astoria native?
I am not. I grew up in Sandy, but I've lived in Astoria it'll be 19 years this year.
Do you foresee a time when, given the recreational marijuana laws here and microbrewing, that they could entwine into a beer?
Again, that is more federal law, and nobody wants to risk their license over that experiment. I've heard there's a few hemp beers. There's been some hemp beers out there. I think it's kind of it'd be fun to play with. I mean, I can't say I haven't played with that at home, but one of my mentors in the past, Conrad Santos, he was one of the head brewer for McMenamins when I first started, and he described it as a waste of perfectly good dope to be putting it in beer. So I'm sure the potential is there to do that. And you just got to be really, it's going to be interesting if they ever come about that, because you have to be really careful. I mean, then you're dealing with two things in the same. And for the body, I think alcohol is way tougher on the body than marijuana is. And it has a lot more, as far as the other, driving cars and stuff, so you start mixing them, and nobody really has studied all that stuff. So I do not see that happening legally anytime soon. Though now that you can buy that stuff, and it's much easier to get these days, I'm sure homebrewers are messing with it all the time. And they've always driven beer styles, and so who knows?
I tried a beer lately that had milk in it, made with milk.
Lactose sugar. Was it called like a milk stout, or?
I don't remember. It was Birdside.
Yeah, so usually when you see a milk stout or milk this or that, what they're using is lactose sugar. So it's they just break down the milk to the sugars and then dry that out, and you get a lactose sugar. Yeah.
Can you talk about regionalism in beer? Like, I remember when you were first starting Fort George, you told me the worst beer you ever had was a Black Butte in Dallas.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Fort George, just our thing is we restrict our distribution to Oregon, Washington, Idaho. And most of that is because we don't filter our beer. We don't do a lot of things to our beer that will make it stable for a long period of time. We don't add any preservatives or anything like that that you have to do if you're going to ship it across the country. And also, there's just the feeling that we want our beer to be from here. When you travel around, I think it's really cool to try beers that you don't see in other places rather than see the same beers you see at home. And beers just don't taste that good when they get that far away, I don't feel. We get requests all the time for our beer in Florida, in New Jersey, in California, in where else? I've had people, a lot of interest in Korea and Japan and China for our beer. But unless you're there to support it and teach people about it and make sure people are storing it and using it correctly, all you're going to do is people will get bad beer and then taste it and then hate your brewery and bring down craft beer in general.
Might be a little bit of a follow-up, but how are you hoping to grow Fort George, just over the next 5 years, say, in terms of what you're brewing and just...
So if you've ever been to Fort George, we are in an old 1921, it was an auto dealership with beams like this. It's kind of, it feels very similar in there. It's nice in here. And we have almost filled it up with brewing equipment. And so we have still a couple of tricks up our sleeve where we could get more production out of there. Like we can put some tanks outside and stuff like that. But we're kind of approaching, especially with our growth rate, we're approaching that ceiling. So like you're saying, it's a challenge. And if you've got any ideas, let you know. So one of the things is not just to make more beer, but to make higher value beer. So we've started this bottling program out of our barrels that, when you age a beer for a year in a barrel, it really adds a lot of character to it and a lot of value to it. And so that's kind of one of our tracks, is to make more valuable beer and then be more efficient, just find efficiencies.
On the barrel side, I just noticed that barrels seem to be a big part of what's happening in beer now. It's almost like a new bittering agent. It's a way to add bourbon and other flavors. Why do you think the wineries got the barrels? And other than the Belgians, that beer wasn't really aged in barrels until recently.
So if I got it right, you're asking why?
Why are we now just putting beer in barrels?
All the time?
Yeah.
Well, that's a very distinctive and intense flavor that not everybody wants. It's heavy. It's a big flavor. And in my opinion, there are light, refreshing wines that aren't heavily, you don't get a lot of oak out of and stuff. So I think it's just a spectrum of flavor and stuff. And so over on the lighter, easier drinking side, you don't have those. And it's really expensive.
Do large breweries, hams, is there really an expiration date?
Absolutely. Beer is perishable, no matter how many things
So
you
if
put
I
in.
see a hams that's 6 months old, what would you say to that?
It depends on how the hams has been treated. If that hams has been in a cooler for 6 months, it's fine. If that hams has been in the back seat of your car for 6 months, especially over the summer where it's going, 100 degrees and then down to 50 degrees and 100 degrees and 50 degrees, yeah. That's an emergency hams.
Yeah, I've tasted those hams and I finished them, but I didn't like it. So, also, what makes carbonation? How does that happen?
So the byproducts of fermentation with the yeast eats the sugar molecule, breaks it down to carbon dioxide, and then the heat and alcohol are the other byproducts. You catch that last little bit of carbonation. So you let most of that carbonation vent off, or it would just be too foamy. Catch that last little bit, and that will carbonate the beer. And the carbonation really adds to the flavor and the texture of the beer.
I wouldn't drink beer if it wasn't carbonated.
Yeah, it's still beer is. Someone tries to sell you a still beer, that's like a bad home brewer trick. That's not good.
There's different levels of carbonation.
Sure.
Do you have an opinion about it kind of seems like Americans prefer more carbonated beer versus?
So your light American lager, the only way that tasted good at all is to be super spritzy. And your lighter wheat beers are great to have a lot of carbonation. Your stout, you have just a little bit of carbonation to give it a nice head and everything. It's different. So yeah, and we vary those in our different styles.
Recently, CBD beers have merged onto the market thanks to Coalition. Have you had this beer? Did you like it? And is this something that Fort George may or may not be interested in doing sometime in the future?
I haven't tried their beer, although I'm curious about it. And no, we're not going to make those beers.
Okay.
We have our kind of thing, and we love playing with herbs and different beer styles and stuff. But I don't feel like being the pot beer guys. It's not our thing.
I'm curious how you see your role as like a leader in this industry. You mentioned earlier how it's kind of like a David and Goliath situation with craft brewers versus the multinationals. And I don't know, is there like some certain legacy you're hoping to create?
You're asking me what my personal role is?
Yeah.
Wow. I don't know. I've never thought of that. The things I like to leverage our brewery, beer is amazing for leveraging things with. You know, people come to us for donations all the time for different things. And my line is, we are a beer-rich, cash-poor organization. So whatever I can get you in beer, it's great. So I love supporting local causes and local things like that. In the last year, we've hired a sustainability director for our brewery. And one of her charges, she has many different things. And so she's trying to make our brewery more efficient. She's trying to reduce our waste. She's trying to make us, less water use, less energy use. But the other thing we can do is use her in our community. And she is trying to organize the other restaurants in our town to get the city on board for to do home pickup of yard debris. So this is just the first step. So once Recology will pick up yard debris, then they have to have a place for that. And then once they have a place for that, then we can pressure them for commercial composting for all the restaurants. And that will reduce the stuff we're sending to the landfill and then send all that stuff to a commercial. So those are the kind of things that I try to use our brewery for, is to like promote those different causes. In fact, I just had a thing printed in the Daily Astoria, I think it got printed today, about carbon credits. And so they don't call it carbon, they have a new name for it, but it's basically carbon credits for the state of Oregon is trying to implement those things. And I wrote an article, theoretically, I am a prominent local businessman now, and whatever that means, I try to use our influence for the power of good, the don't be evil thing, for whatever that's worth. But I don't do much as far as the industry-wide stuff. I'm not on the Oregon Brewers Guild board. I don't go to a lot of meetings and stuff like that. I try to do most of the stuff at home. I think that was the question you were asking. Are we done?
So are there people brewing?
Oh, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Sorry. Are there people brewing Brew It still?
I believe Jason at Burnside Brewing has made close to a gruit. But nobody's making gruits with wormwood and all that other stuff in it. Wormwood is strictly prohibited to being used. It can be dangerous.
So would that gruit that they're brewing over at Burnside, it wouldn't have sort of the psychoactive property that wormwood might introduce into it?
Right.
Things along those lines.
There's, like I say, there's a lot of rules right now about what you can put in beer, but I would love to see more of that stuff being made. I think it was a brewery Jason was actually involved with. What was that? It was the first organic brewery over, what was that place called? Do you remember? It was Jason and, can't think of the other guy's name right now, but he started the Organic Brewers Festival. But do you know that guy? Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, I was going to ask you about absinthe, because they recently legalized absinthe.
Absinthe wormwood is used in absinthe,
Yes.
right? Yes. So,
Yeah.
do they actually still use it in absinthe, or did it was traditionally used in absinthe?
Everything that I understood was in the States.
In order for it to be called
wormwood, but the fermentation process isn't to the extent that they do to get the psychoactive properties out of it, or maybe it's the distilling process. I'm not really sure, but what I got out of it was you're not going to have as much fun in the United States drinking absinthe as you would maybe other places drinking absinthe, like Barcelona or something that
Gotcha.
will let it get much
Where they let you
stronger.
put that stuff in.
So they're like comfortable with walking a fine line between poison and fun.
That's what I'm hearing. I mean, alcohol technically is
What do you
poison.
do wrong?
Well, Retsina is like close to poison anyhow, so has this devolved into a
I have kind of a woo-woo question.
okay, woo-woo question?
I have a woo-woo question. So I know some people who grow weed, and they are like, okay, if you plant like with the cycles of the moon and harvest with the cycles of the moon, it like produces a better plant. Do you know if anybody brews that way?
I've heard about, and I think it's more gimmicky than anything, I've heard about people brewing on full moons or brewing on like solstice and things like that. I've never done that. Yes.
What are your thoughts on the emergence of a Northeast style IPA?
Oh my goodness, you really opened a can of worms there. So Northeast style IPA, and I'm glad this is going on tape. You can cut this out. And so. I do have an opinion about that. So the idea between a Northeast style of IPA is a very hazy, what they call fruity, juicy is another term they use. Our good friends at Great Notion are brewing really good examples of that, I'm going to do air quotes, style of beer. And that started, I think it's Treehouse Brewing. There's a couple breweries on the East Coast, like in Vermont especially, that started that style. And when I sent my brewers, I haven't gone to a craft brewers conference in a few years, but I sent them, they were going to Boston 2 years ago, I think, for that craft brewers conference. I said, okay, so when you're sitting at the bar, talking to that brewer from the Northeast about their Northeast style IPA or Vermont style IPA, just do this. Just say, you know, when we first started making beers in the Northwest, we had some haze issues too, but we figured it out. But that being said, this year's, I know that's really kind of, this year's, our three-way IPA, we do this collaboration with two brewers for our summer seasonal every year. We are collaborating this year with Great Notion and Reuben's Brews in Seattle on a Northeast style IPA. And these beers were coming, we do all these test beers for it. I'm like, you know, I would not accept that. I would make you go change the keg if this wasn't the style. It looks horrible. It looks like, and again, I loved them. I worked for them and I loved them. It looked like a McMenamins beer from 1992 is what it looks like. Yes?
So on that haze issue, do you think that like the proliferation of ales versus lagers has been because it's easier and cheaper to brew an ale than it is, you know, to brew a lager, you need a larger organization?
The whole ales lagers thing is ales are a lot more flavor forward. They're not as, which isn't always the truth, but or always the case, but it's just tank time. You can turn an ale tank in 10 days, 14 days, whereas true lagers take 6 to 8 weeks. And so that's just time. It's just time is money, and using a tank that long takes that long, so you need that many more tanks to keep up. So that's kind of the thing there. And, you know, I used to think sour beers were a really bad idea. When I was taught if a beer tasted sour, that was to go back down the drain. That was supposed to go back to Mother Earth. You were not supposed to serve that to people. And when I first started talking to these people, like Tom Arthur, he gave a lecture over in Bend about his sour program. And I asked him, I said, so does it turn out exactly like you plan on it turning out? He's like, oh, no. And I said, well, what do you do? And he goes, well, I sell it. And I just thought it was a really cheap thing away. But I will admit, my palate has evolved. I've come to appreciate sour beers, and especially certain styles of sour beers that are done right and blended right and don't just make your mouth like turn into, you know, kind of pucker up. There is really something there. And so I could be wrong about the hazy IPA. The whole idea, the hazy IPA is supposed to be these yeast are keeping the aromatics in suspension. They're not settling out. And so it creates more flavor and more this juicy flavor, whatever, that they're looking for. And I have to say, the beers, that three-way IPA, we just kegged it off today, and it was delicious. It was really good. So I've been wrong before. It doesn't happen very often.
Jack, I do a podcast called Brew Happy, and there's been a lot of conjecture lately on the acquisition of, you know, big beer buying up the little guys, especially with Wicked Weed and Lagunitas recently. It seems as though big beer is trying to acquire popular craft beer properties in each state and try to, you know, control and guide the market in that way. with respect to the smaller craft brewers that are trying to expand their brand and are struggling to meet demands with their capacity, where do you see this going for small craft brewers? Small craft breweries. Oh, I like it. And is Fort George ever in the market to sell, or what would they do if they were? What do you think Fort George would do if they were approached?
So if you look at a map of all the breweries that have been acquired over the last 5-7 years or so, there's a strategy going on. There's a regional strategy. You can see they're picking out these places. Some of these brewers, like Wicked Weed is a good example of a brewery that was built from the beginning by the owners to be sold.
Yes.
And we would be a very unlikely target for acquisition. We are so kind of enveloped as our local thing and locally involved and personality kind of driven that I really don't see them offering anything to us. You know, even 10 Barrel, the people who started 10 Barrel, their original money came from a Budweiser distributorship. So I don't doubt that from the very beginning it was in their minds to make that sale and cash in like that. In a lot of, if you're in the software world, best thing that can happen to you, and everyone claps when Google buys you or Facebook buys you or Apple buys you. You've made it big, you finally think. And so there's a good part of the population that has the same feeling about, you know, you made such a great brand and such a thing that Anheuser-Busch wanted to buy you. You should be thrilled by that. And what I don't believe is that I don't believe the quality stays the same. I want to know that when I spend $5.50 on a pint of beer, that the bartender and the owner of that bar and the brewer of that beer is getting the vast majority of that money, and that Budweiser, a big corporation, isn't skimming off the cream and taking that home for their own coffers to buy up another brewery somewhere. That's my personal feeling. Maybe people don't care. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
And I will say right now, which I've said a bunch of times, if somebody dropped a X million dollar check on my desk and said, all you got to do is endorse this and go play disc golf for the rest of your life, who's to know? You know, it's like, you know, you got to go home to your wife and say, yeah, I turned down $10 million today, honey. It's like, what?
Yeah.
I can't imagine us doing it. I just can't imagine Fort George thriving under that kind of ownership. I think I would lose half my staff the first day. I would lose half my guests, customers the next day, and all of my credibility. So,
how does a craft brewery combat distribution problems without having to sell to distributorship or sell to a big beer, which controls the majority of the distributors?
Well, our solution, I don't know if it's right for everybody, but my business partner is kind of a genius. And about 5 years ago, he decided that we were going to sell, we've always self-distributed our own beer. Well, we started our own distributorship. We started taking on other beers to sell. And so we distribute all sorts of beers on the North Coast, in addition to ours, to protect our brand and to protect our area. And then, you know, we sell the vast majority of our beer here in Portland to Melitus, which is a Budweiser house here in Astoria. So if they ever got bought up by Budweiser and all the craft brands got kicked out, we'd have trouble. But at least we have our foot in the door and we've got something going on. So,
okay.
Yes.
I was wondering how Bowie affects Astoria. Has it helped? Has it hurt? Is it different? They seem like they came out really hard and fast and built a big, beautiful shop.
Yeah, they're great folks. Love Kevin Shaw, the brewer there, is a great guy, and the people running the place are great folks. People who started it are all locals, and they have a beautiful place. They make great beer. And the big issue in Astoria right now is not customers, but we don't compete for customers between us. We compete for employees. And so, especially this time of year, we're hiring up for summer. They are that's where we compete with them, and that's where it's a little difficult sometimes, is keeping our people happy so they don't go to Bowie and et cetera. So, but I appreciate it. I think they have helped turn Astoria into sort of a craft beer destination. So it's kind of a momentum for the whole place. There's another brewery, Reach Break Brewery, that's just opened right around the corner from us. Happy to see that stuff going on.
Other than clearly loving beer, what about you makes you a great brewer?
I'm sorry.
Other than loving beer, what about you makes you a great brewer? Like, what do you think personality traits wise makes a great brewer?
Are you talking about Fort George? We're talking about me. If you were to talk to my employee brewers right now, there's hardly any of them that would consider me a great brewer right now. So I used to be a great brewer. I don't really even describe myself as a brewer anymore. I am a proprietor. I'm a co-owner. I'm a administrator. I can brew here and there. They don't let me brew on the big system, that's for sure, but I can brew on the little one. Within a couple of weeks, it'll all come back to me. The brewing is kind of a great job to have in your 20s. By the time you're brewing into your late 30s, you should really be thinking about, what your next step is going to be, because it really takes its toll on your body. It beats you up. And my back is a mess. If I don't, I'm happy not brewing anymore. And I don't want to pretend to be a brewer, because I think it's really important. I knew when I was a brewer, I would bristle up right away for one of my employer bosses. Wouldn't even know how to stir the mash, describe themselves as a brewer. It'd drive me nuts. And so I don't really do that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I've heard from somewhere that there's some theories about the beginning of civilization being not necessarily a result of agriculture, but fermentation and brewing. And I just wanted to know what kind of thoughts you had on that for your research.
Well, like I mentioned about the Egyptians growing barley and having big barley agricultural thing going on. You don't grow barley for food. You grow barley for brewing. It's really the only excellent use for that. There's lots of other grains you could be growing for making bread or whatnot. And I happily will believe that civilization was created to organize the domestication of grains to brew with. That's a fine story for me. I don't, I don't know of any proof of that or evidence.
I have a question about my favorite beer.
Is that the one you're holding?
Usually,
Yeah.
I do always say that, but I often say on my Brew Happy podcast that the Cavatica Stout is the sexiest beer on planet Earth.
Oh, nice.
Who made the Cavatica Stout? Yes! You are a brewer.
So Cavatica Stout is an evolution. It's a so that's great. It's a Cavatica Stout started as Terminator Stout, and then when I went to Colorado and brewed there, it became Thunderhead Stout. And then when I worked in Central Oregon at Cascade Lakes Brewing, it was Grizzly Mountain Stout. And then at Bill's Tavern in Cannon Beach, it was 2x4 Stout. And then it evolved into Cavatica Stout at Fort George. So back in the day, when I brewed for McMenamins, basically all the brewers kind of made things the way they wanted to. There wasn't really the recipe thing they had now. So basically, I tell you, that is like 5 parts two-row, 1 part black barley. And you're in. That's it. Cascade hops.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was awesome.
I'll tell you more about the Cavatica. So Cavatica, I've always had kind of an affinity with spiders in breweries, because there was this tradition in Belgian breweries to never kill a spider, because they kind of kept the biome going, and kept the right bugs going in there. So spiders were always revered by brewers. And in the book by E.B. White, she introduces herself as Charlotte A. Cavatica in Charlotte's Web. And A. cavatica being the scientific name for the common brown spider. And then deeper than that even, the Latin root of cavatica is an abyss or a dark place.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's just like 3-4 levels deep. That's good. Can we end it on that?
Yeah.
you, everybody. You're very patient.
That's great.
Oh, good. Can I turn this off?
Yeah, you can
Okay.
totally turn that off.
Okay.
Totally worth walking next door.
All right. We return on June 6th with Matt Reed of Bee Thinking with his talk, Natural Beekeeping for the Conscientious Hobbyist. For more information, check out our website, curiosityclub.handiesupply.com, and follow our social media pages. Thanks so much. And, hang out for a little bit if you want. There's more cold Fort George beers in the tub, I think. And yeah. All right. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.